Hello, ma'am. Can we start? Okay. A very good morning to all. Now we have entered the second day of our 3-day international workshop on research methodology and doctoral colloquium. First of all, I welcome Dr. Vijayamohanan Pillai N, Honorary Fellow, Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, Thiruvananthapuram. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Anita V, Professor, Head and Organizing Secretary of this workshop. Welcome, ma'am. Next, I welcome Professor Manju S. Nair, Dean, School of Social Sciences, University of Kerala. Welcome, ma'am. And I welcome all the teaching faculty, non-teaching faculty, research scholars, and other friends from the university and outside the university to this workshop. Welcome all. Yeah. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Vijayamohanan Pillai N, Honorary Fellow, Gulati Institute of Finance and Technology, Thiruvananthapuram. Okay. Here is some details about Dr. Vijayamohanan Pillai. About his education, he recorded first rank in MA Economics, University of Kerala in 1986. He qualified UGC NET exam in 1986, and he has done PhD dissertation in the Department of Econometrics, University of Madras, Chennai, and his work also had some highly commended. His publications include 5 books and 2 ebooks. He has published 42 working papers and 32 articles and 3 articles in native language, that is Malayalam. And his highlights include original theoretical and empirical contributions to Markov chain model in the context of analysis of inflation and human development growth nexus, peak load pricing, reliability analysis, and aggregation theory, and reinterpretation of the concept of human development and public action in the context of Kerala State of India and local dynamics of social security with empirical exercises for India. And he has completed 3 major projects for Ford Foundation, Harvard University, along with Sanskriti Foundation, New Delhi, India, and Planning Commission of India. And he has 1 ongoing major project for Energy Management Center, Government of Kerala. And he has taught mathematics, basic econometrics, some topics in applied econometrics, macroeconomics, economics of project evaluation, etc. At the CDS. And he has supervised 8 MA projects, 22 MPhil dissertations, 14 PhD, among which 6 has been awarded and 8 are ongoing. And he has supervised 11 K&Raj fellowships and 74 summer internships as well. Moving on to his other contributions, as a member of the core group that prepared the human Development Report of Kerala 2005. He prepared 3 background papers and rewrote most of the report and drafted the acknowledgements section. And as associate coordinator of the MPhil program at CDS, he was actively involved in designing the new MPhil curriculum in 2003-4 and in preparing and bringing out the MPhil program handbook. He involved in preparing and fine-tuning the syllabi of the following papers for MA program at CDS in 2011-12. They are mathematics for economics, econometrics, theory and applications, topics in applied econometrics, history of economic thought and statistics, theory and applications. Member of different he has been a member of different committees, different universities, PhD thesis evaluator and Viva was board chairman. He has also given special talks in Malayalam on all India Radio Trivandrum, Kerala, and 3 conferences, training program coordination. He has 5 he has coordinated 5 conferences and 24 conferences, workshops, 244 conferences, workshops, and external teaching. He has also reviewed some articles like International Journal of Energy and Power Engineering, American Journal of Theoretical and Applied Statistics, American Journal of Electrical Power and Energy Systems, Innovation and Development, Gender, Technology and Development, AMITI, Journal of Economics, Migration and Development, Journal Economic and Political Weekly. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Vijay Mohanan Pillai to speak about on the methodology of experimental economics. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Mahin. It was a long list. Okay. So, I have a presentation, so I shall share the screen. So you can see this, right?
Yes, sir.
Can you see? Anybody?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay. So I am talking on experimental economics, and tomorrow I will talk on behavioral economics. These two are basically highly interrelated. So without experimental economics, there is no behavioral economics. That's the situation today. That's why I have taken experimental economics first. Now, what I'm going to do here is giving a very fundamental, basic introduction to experimental economics. So, I start with the experiments as such in general science terms. Then I will talk about the types of experiments, and without understanding the nature of experiments and types of experiments, it will be difficult to understand their role in economics. That is why I'm taking up these preliminary steps. Okay. Then I will give a discussion on the economic methodology, because the economic methodology has gone a sea change from non-experimental approach to experimental approach. So I will talk about that. Then I will give a brief history of experimental economics, including the different methods used in experimental economics. There is some problem with the mic. Okay, so I am starting with the experiment as such. We know this is a procedure that we do, especially in physical science, either to support or to reject a hypothesis, or we also do experiment to determine the efficacy or the probability of something previously untried. So then, since we are carrying out an experiment in terms of hypothesis, we should have an independent variable and a dependent variable, and we will manipulate in an experiment the independent variable so that its effect, the manipulation of the independent variable's effect, we will record on the dependent variable, and this will give us some insight into some cause and effect relationship. So when I told you that we have a dependent variable in relation or in function of an independent variable which we manipulate, we are typically using control, because the manipulation of the independent variable is similar to controlling the behavior of the independent variable. So we have a controlled environment in experiment. So in addition to the independent variable that also may be taken as a control variable, we may have some other factors that may be affecting both the independent variable and the dependent variable. If we want to find out a cause and effect relationship between independent variable and the dependent variable, entirely only the pure relationship between independent variable and the dependent variable, then we have to control for the other variables, other factors that are affecting the independent variable and the dependent variable. So every experiment in physical science includes controls that will minimize the effects of the factors other than the single independent variable. These other factors, or in statistics we call them the third factor, or the third element, they are in general called confounding factors, because they are confounding the relationship. They tend to confound the relationship between the dependent variable and the independent variable. The effect of these confounding factors we have to control. So in every experiment we will have control, or we do the experiment in a controlled environment. So as I already told you, we have to control the confounding factors, and through scientific controls we eliminate the confounding factors influence. Otherwise, in addition to the scientific controls, in other experiments we use what is called randomized experiment. Somebody has opened why don't you mute? Okay.
And now it is muted.
So in some experiments where the scientific controls are not possible, we use what is called a random assignment, as in the randomized experiments. So I will come to the types of experiments and tell about the randomized experiments. Experiments we also call trials. Now, in engineering and the physical sciences, that is physics and chemistry, the scientific methods include a lot of experiments. They are used to test theories and hypotheses about how the physical processes work under certain conditions. Typically, these experiments in engineering and physical sciences focus on replication of identical procedures. That is, whenever we do an experiment in a particular controlled environment, that particular experiment must be replicable. That is, it must be repeatable in any other laboratory under the similar environment. That's a must condition for scientific experiment. That is the repeatability or the replicability. So replication of the same procedure we have to do, so that we can come to what is called the internal validity of the experiment. Remember, internal validity of the experiment is very important. Internal validity represents this particular case, that is getting the same result when we repeat the experiments in different environments under the same framework. So for internal validity, replication is very essential. And remember, in these sciences, engineering and physical sciences, random assignment is not at all used. So this is the scientific experiment. Remember, the scientific, this type of scientific experiment we do only in engineering, physics, and chemistry. In other sciences, we do not do this. For example, I am giving the Boyle's law. You know, this is a very famous law that you have studied in your school, in your school classes. It says that pressure is inversely proportional to the volume. And this relationship we are getting when we control for certain confounding factors. What are the confounding factors? Those factors are mass and temperature. It is written here, frozen variables are mass and temperature. So we keep these confounding factors constant, or we control these factors. And in that controlled environment, we can find that the pressure is inversely proportional to volume. So this is one of the famous scientific experiments. So I hope that now you have got an idea about the confounding factors and the necessity of controlling for their effect. So this particular experiment must be repeatable. We will do this in different environments, keeping volume and keeping mass and temperature constant, and repeat it, and we will find that pressure will be inversely proportional to the volume. Now I am coming to the types of experiments. We have controlled experiments, as in the scientific experiments, then natural experiments, then quasi experiments, field experiments, then randomized experiments. These randomized experiments will appear in other cases also. For example, the quasi experiments or field experiments and all other things, but not in controlled experiments and natural experiments. Starting with the controlled experiment. This compares the results obtained from experimental samples against controlled samples. See, in a controlled experiment, whether the scientific experiment or otherwise, in a controlled experiment, we will have two samples. One is the experimental sample and the other is the controlled sample. We will be comparing between these two samples. and recording the changes in their behavior. Now these control samples are practically the same or identical with the experimental sample, except for the one aspect whose effect is being tested, that is the independent variable. The independent variable will be defined for the two samples. Otherwise, the experimental sample and the control sample will be from the same population. They will be identical in all respects. A good example is a clinical trial for the efficacy of a drug. See, in medical science, we are using a controlled experiment. Actually, the scientific experiment where we can control the confounding factors, as we have seen in the case of the Boyle's law, we cannot do in medical science for a drug trial. So that is why we do a controlled experiment using an experimental sample and a control sample separately. So in this example, what we do is, see, for example, the case of a drug trial, the sample or the group receiving the drug would be the experimental group. Then the one receiving the placebo or the regular treatment would be the control one. That is, what we do is, we will have two samples, the experimental or the treatment sample. In some cases, we call it treatment sample, and then the control sample. We want to find out the efficacy of a particular drug, and we will administer the drug to the experimental or the treatment sample only, and the control sample will be given the usual treatment only. That is, the usual treatment is called a placebo. In medical language, it is called a placebo. So in some cases, we will not give the meaning as regular treatment. We will say only placebo. So that is the usual treatment. And then after the treatment, after the usual treatment and the drug, the new drug treatment, we will find out the changes in the two samples, experiment sample and the control sample. And these changes or the differences, we will measure in order to find out the efficacy of that particular drug. So this is such process is a controlled experiment. So in medical sciences, we are doing a controlled experiment like this. And this type of controlled experiment we actually do in the social sciences also, and that is a replication of the medical or the clinical trial. Now, in many laboratory experiments, it is good practice to have several replicate samples, repeated samples for the test being performed. Then we will get an average of all the results from the different repeated samples. And in case any one of the repetition is obviously inconsistent with the results of the other samples, we will just discard the result of that one as an experimental error, because we may not have done certain test procedures, or we may have done some test procedures mistakenly, and that is why we will discard that. We assume that the inconsistent result is because of the some errors that we have committed. So we'll discard it, and we get an overall result out of the averaging one. That is, we do the aggregation there. We will replicate a large number of samples. Now the natural experiments and quasi experiments we do because sometimes the controlled experiments become prohibitively difficult or impossible. So either the natural experiments or quasi experiments. Now, what is this natural experiment? It's an empirical study in which individual or groups of individuals are exposed to the experimental and controlled conditions that are determined by nature itself or by other factors outside the control of the investigators. That is, in natural experiment, we do not have a man-made controlled environment. But still we will be having an experimental group and a control group, or a treatment group and a control group. But those are determined by nature, nothing outside the nature. So a natural experiment is done outside the man-made controlled environment. The process governing the exposures, remember the exposure is related to the experimental group. Okay, for example, the new drug we are treating with the experimental group only. That new drug is an exposure, and this process of governing the exposure resembles a random assignment. So even though it is a natural one, so the natural experiments are in effect observational studies and are not controlled in the traditional sense of a randomized experiment. That is, there is no intervention at all. So that is the natural experiment. But remember, it is an observational study, but it is not the usual observational study. There is a difference between the natural experiment and observational study. Natural experiment is an observational experiment. The usual observational study does not contain the two groups, experimental group and control group. These two conditions are not there in the usual observational studies. But in natural experiments, we have the usual, these two groups, the treatment groups and the control group. So that's the difference between natural experiment and the observational study, even though a natural experiment is an observational study. Now, the natural experiments are most useful when there is a clearly defined exposure, such as the treatment with a new drug involving a well-defined subpopulation and the absence of exposure in a similar subpopulation, such that changes in outcomes may be plausibly attributed to the exposure. This is what I have already told you. That is, natural experiments we can conduct if we have two types of samples. That is the subpopulation. We have a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group is exposed to a particular treatment, and there is an absence of such an exposure to the control group. And then we will observe the changes or measure the changes in the outcomes of these two groups, control group and the treatment group. And the difference we will measure. And if the difference is very significant, then we will say that the particular drug is, in the case of the controlled experiment, the particular drug is efficacious. Okay. In natural experiment also, we will have these two types of exposures. That is, there is an exposure and there is an absence of exposure. That is, we have a treatment group and a control group. In this sense, the difference between a natural experiment particular difference is not at all there. So that in a natural experiment, there is a scope for finding the causal inference, but that is not possible in the non-experimental observation study. That is, causal inferences are possible in natural experiments because we have the two groups. In usual observation study, this is not possible. The natural experiment is used in several research areas, for example, in epidemiology, like evaluating the health impact of varying degrees of exposure to ionizing radiation in people living near atomic power plants. Actually, after the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a lot of people were subject to the exposure to ionizing radiation. And a large number of epidemiological studies came out using such natural experiments. And this also is used in economics, like estimating the economic return on cost of schooling for adults. Now we come to the randomized controlled experiments. Experiments are also called trials. So usually it is called randomized trials or randomized controlled trials. We have these two types, randomized trials and randomized controlled trials. In randomized trials, we do not have any control. But in randomized control trials, we have control. That's the difference between these two, even though sometimes we use these two terms synonymously. And these experiments are those that allow the greatest reliability and validity of statistical estimates of treatment effects. In these trials, we are using what is called a randomization procedure. This randomization involves randomly allocating the experimental units across the treatment groups. For example, if an experiment compares a new drug against a standard drug, then the patients should be allocated to either the new drug or to the standard drug control using randomization. So we select the respondents randomly and put them randomly in the two groups. That is the process called randomization. And this randomization gives the greatest reliability and validity of statistical estimates. And that is why in sampling procedures, we are advised to go for a random sample. Okay, random sample. Now with a random assignment, that is randomly assigning the respondents into the two groups, the study participants have the same probability of being assigned to the intervention group or the comparison group. This intervention group is the treatment group. The comparison group is the control group. Okay, we have many different terms for these two groups. Intervention group is the treatment group. The comparison group is the control group. The treatment group also is called experimental group. So as a result of such random assignment, differences between groups on both the observed and unobserved characteristics would be only because of chance rather than because of a systematic factor related to treatment. For example, the illness severity. So the random assignment, and actually that is why the random assignment is used in these experiments. Now, as I told you earlier, these two terms are sometimes used synonymously, but the first one, randomized controlled trial, RCT, includes control, but the second one, randomized trial, does not control any, does not include any control. So where do we use then the randomized trials? We use the randomized trials to compare multiple treatment groups with each other in the absence of a control group. So whenever we have a number of treatment groups for comparison, we use the randomized trials without a control group. So in those cases, we say we have an RT or randomized trial. Otherwise, when we have a treatment group and a control group, then we have randomized control trials. Even though the statisticians sometimes use these two terms synonymously. Now about the randomized control trials, I have a presentation that I have presented in the gift something back, and it is available in my ResearchGate page, the randomized control trials, a detailed discussion of the RCT as it was used in the poor economics by Banerjee and Defro, you know, right? Okay, so that is when those Nobel laureates became famous. That time, Gift organized a seminar on their contributions, and I have presented this randomized control trial. That presentation is available in my ResearchGate page. You can have a see. Now a controlled experiment. Now I am just going back to the Bible. We can find in the Bible, in the Old Testament's book of Daniel, a suggestion of a controlled experiment. So I'm giving those things. I'm just giving some quotations from the Bible, and otherwise I am just briefing it. It's a long story. So the king Nebuchadnezzar proposed that some Israelites each a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Daniel preferred a vegetarian diet along with his friends, other 3 friends. But the official in charge of providing the food and wine was a little afraid. He said, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of it." So the official was a little concerned because he may lose his head if he agrees to the vegetarian diet. Then Daniel proposed a sort of controlled experiment. He said, the Bible does not say that this is a controlled experiment, okay? Daniel says, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So we see a controlled experiment in Bible also. So we have a treatment group, and the treatment group is the other people who ate the royal food, and the other way. That is the control group is the men who ate the royal food. And Daniel and his 3 colleagues belong to the treatment group. Now, what are these quasi-experiments? Not the full experiments, only quasi-experiments. Most of the researchers in several science disciplines, including economics, human geography, archaeology, sociology, cultural anthropology, geology, paleontology, ecology, meteorology, and astronomy, all these rely on quasi-experiments, not the full experiments, not the natural experiments, not the controlled experiments, because in all these cases, the controlled experiments may not be feasible often. Now, what is this quasi-experiment? This is an empirical interventional study used to estimate the causal impact of an intervention on target population without random assignment. So here also we have an intervention on the target population, but there is no random assignment at all. So the quasi-experimental research shares similarities with the traditional experimental design or randomized controlled trial, but it specifically lacks the element of random assignment to treatment or to control. So it quasi-experiment specifically lacks the element of random assignment. And the quasi-experimental designs typically allow the researcher to control the assignment to the treatment condition, but using some criterion other than a random assignment. For example, keeping an eligibility cutoff mark. So usually this is the case. We will have a threshold level. If anything goes beyond the threshold level or the cutoff mark, then we will say that we have a marked improvement. So this cutoff mark or the threshold level is used instead of the random assignment in quasi experiments. We have a number of types of quasi experimental designs. Difference in differences. See, almost all of these are there for the randomized controlled experiments also. Okay, in quasi experimental design also we have these cases. Difference in differences. That is, we will have the pre-post case with and without comparison. I believe that you know these cases, pre and post. That is, we have a particular intervention. So before intervention and after the intervention, and this we will have with and without intervention. That is, we have an experimental group and a control group. And we have the pre-post intervention in both the cases. Remember, the intervention is only for the treatment group. But we will have these two cases, pre-post and without case in both the cases. So we will take the difference in differences and measure the change. Then we have what is called a regression discontinuity design. Then propensity score matching and a number of other methods are also there. Among all these designs, it is the regression discontinuity design that this is an econometric method, regression discontinuity design, and it is available in Stata and other statistical packages. This regression discontinuity design comes closest to the experimental design, as the experimenter maintains control of the treatment assignment, and it is known to yield an unbiased estimate of the treatment effects. But even then, most of the people use the difference in differences method, because the regression discontinuity design involves using a time series data. So where we do not have any time series data, continuous time series data, then we have to go for only the difference in differences method or the propensity score match with only two periods, pre and post, with the two groups, with and without group, without control group, without treatment group. Now, something more about the regression discontinuity design. It does, however, require large number of study participants and precise modeling of the functional form between the assignment and the outcome variable. So remember, the regression discontinuity design we can do in two ways, using a large time series data as well as a large cross-section data. Here we are talking about the cross-section data only. Okay, earlier I was talking about the time series data. The Stata regression discontinuity design is designed for the time series aspect, time series data only. Now, field experiments. So this is so named to distinguish them from the lab experiments. Now, as I told you earlier, the lab experiments, when the experiments are repeated several times, will show what is called the internal validity. Internal validity. Okay. Now we have something called external validity also. And the lab experiments do not have any external validity because the lab environment cannot be reinvented or cannot be designed outside the lab or in field. So the lab experiments usually do not have any external validity, but this external validity is available with the field experiments. So in field experiments, we enforce the scientific control by testing a hypothesis in the artificial and highly controlled setting of a laboratory. So this refers to the laboratory experiment. Okay, that is, the laboratory experiment has an artificial and highly controlled setting, and this we do not have in the field experiments, and that is why actually the social science experimenters go for field experiments, especially in the analysis of education and health interventions. And you remember Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kremer got the 2019 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences using the field experiments for showing its efficacy in alleviating the global poverty. So actually these people popularized the field experiments. The field experiments have the advantage that the outcomes are observed in a natural setting, that is a real world setting, rather than in an artificial and highly controlled lab environment. For this reason, field experiments are seen as having higher external validity than the lab experiments. Field experiments offer researchers a way to test theories and answer questions with higher external validity because they simulate real-world occurrences. Now remember, if the field experiments are repeatable and everywhere we get the same result, then the field experiments also have got internal validity in addition to the external validity. And that is why the Nobel organization has approved or acknowledged the contributions of those Nobel laureates. However, like natural experiments, field experiments suffer from the possibility of contamination. And that is why often we may not get the internal validity in field experiments, even though we have the external validity. Because of the contamination. That is, the experimental conditions can be controlled with more precision and certainty in the lab. And that precision and certainty are not available in field experiments. Yet, some phenomena cannot be easily studied in a laboratory. For example, the voter turnout in an election, or the education, or the poverty alleviation, or in general, the poverty alleviation in terms of health poverty, or education poverty, or income poverty, whatever be that, we cannot do in a lab environment. So we have to go for field experiments. And what we do here is we randomly assign subjects or other sampling units to either treatment or control groups in order to test claims of causal relationships. Random assignment helps establish the comparability of the treatment and control group, so that any differences between them that emerge after the treatment has been administered plausibly reflect the influence of the treatment rather than the pre-existing differences between the groups. So that is the methodology that we use in field experiments. Some contextual differences we will have as well from naturally occurring experiments, that is the natural experiments and quasi-experiments in the case of field experiments. While natural experiments rely on an external force, for example, a government or a non-profit organization and so on, controlling the randomization treatment, assignment, and implementation, the field experiments require researchers to retain control over randomization and implementation. Remember, in natural experiments, the experimenter or the researcher does not have a control over the randomization and implementation. That is why it is called a natural experiment. But in field experiments, the researcher does have the control. Now I'm coming to the economic methodology as it progressed from the non-experimental one to the experimental one. So economics was traditionally viewed as a primarily non-experimental science. And in the methodological writings of 19th century economists, this particular case was noted very strongly. For example, John Stuart Mill identified several practical obstacles to the use of the experimental method. In particular, the impossibility of controlling key economic variables and of keeping background conditions fixed, that is constant. That is our ceteris paribus condition. So that the effect of manipulating each cause in isolation can be checked. This was Mill's main justification for adopting the so-called a priori deductive method. Deductive method instead of the inductive method, the scientific method, a posteriori method. So the deductive method or the a priori method is a mix of introspection and theoretical reasoning. And that is why the logic and mathematics have been largely used by the economists in the beginning. And this mix of introspection and theoretical reasoning used to determine what an idealized Homo economicus would do in given circumstances. So Mill in 1874 wrote, but we can go further than to affirm that the method a priori is a legitimate mode of philosophical investigation in the moral sciences. We contend that it is the only mode. We affirm that the method a posteriori or that of specific experience is altogether inefficacious in those sciences as a means of arriving at any considerable body of valuable truth. So Mill was against using the usual scientific method in the moral sciences, and he advised for the a priori method, that is the deduction method. Note that the deduction, this a priori method, was the typical method not only of the marginalists, that is Goldmanger, Jevons, Bigstreet, Marshall, Robbins, but also of the equilibrium economists such as Walras, Pareto, Airo, and Debreu, and also of the Austrian school, Mises and Hayek. Then also of the expectations economists from Friedman to Lucas. So for all these economists, deduction was the typical method in economics. And mathematical exercises in economics have been in line with this a priori epistemic pursuit. So in fact, mathematical economics is the deduction method used in economics. Now, Friedman in 1953 wrote, we can seldom test particular predictions in the social sciences by experiments explicitly designed to eliminate what are judged to be the most important disturbing influences. And the very famous textbook by Samuelson, later on by Samuelson and Nordhaus. In 1985, in the 12th edition, they wrote, economists cannot perform the controlled experiments of chemists or biologists because they cannot easily control other important factors. Even though in economics we write keeping other things constant, ceteris paribus, Actually, it is not easily possible. Now, compared with the 1985 remark by Samuelson and Nordos, when they came to the 14th edition, there was a change in the two. Now they wrote, experimental economics is an exciting new development. Between these two editions, the 12th edition and the 14th edition of Samuelson's economists had managed to set up experiments similar to the ones in the natural sciences. So that is the turning point for experimental economics. Now I shall give the last part, the brief history of the experimental economics. We can say that actually experimental economics started with the theory of probability itself, because the theory of probability does have a design of experiments in its basic context. For example, take the case of Bernoulli's St. Petersburg paradox. That actually that was the basis for the theory of probability. Stickler in 1999 substantiated the development of experimentation in psychology with its early adoption of probabilistic statistics, for example, by the polymath philosopher C.S. Peirce in the 1880s itself. The interdisciplinary relationship of economics with psychology and other recent branches of knowledge, such as neurobiology and artificial intelligence, all disciplines sharing the same objective of explaining human decision-making processes in different contexts, has naturally opened up experimentation in economics. The first experiment in economic study was carried out in 1931 by Thurston, a US pioneer in the fields of psychometrics and psychophysics. And he is well known for the approach to measurement called the law of comparative judgment in terms of his scale, the famous Thurston scale, and also for his contributions to factor analysis. But somehow it failed to attract any interest. Thurston's study sought to verify the neoclassical consumer theory by empirically determining an individual indifference score. You are familiar with the indifference score, right? Which is convex to the origin. Every participant in the experiment carried out by Thurston was asked to make a hypothetical, not an actual choice between different baskets containing hats and shoes, then baskets containing hats and jackets, and baskets containing shoes and jackets. Based on the data related to the choices of each individual, he estimated an indifference curve, and he found it to be hyperbola shape, consistent with the theory. You know, hyperbola shaped one is convex to the origin. Even though initially the experiment did not attract any interest, after a decade came some valid comments on this experiment from Milton Friedman and Alan Wallace. They argued with some force from a methodological point of view that the subjects undergoing such experiments act in an artificial environment such that their motivations are not the same as those assumed in the theory. Moreover, in this specific case, they made hypothetical choices only. So those were the criticisms from Friedman and Wallace. Experimental methods he used were more consistent with those of experimental psychology and less with those used by experimental economists today. That was the problem. In the light of this criticism, incentives were later introduced for participants by some experimental economists, but others still consider payoffs unnecessary. But most of the experiments in experimental economics or in behavioral economics are done with incentives. And that was because of this criticism. It was the expected utility theory of von Neumann and Morgenstern in 1944 that gave a new focus to experiments in individual choices. And with this, the game theoretic approach started to be included in the experiments. And this game theoretic approach sparked a way of experimental tests of interactive behavior, resulting in a large volume of literature, such as on prisoner's dilemma, or in the provision of public goods, or in coordination and equilibrium, in auction theory, and about the effects of different rules of market organization. Actually, we have in behavioral economics, the main topic is the behavioral game theory or the behavioral game economics. Compared with the earlier experiments, the expected utility theory made more focused predictions, though the results were much less definite. While some experiments, for instance, Mosteller and Nogi in 1951, supported the utility theory as an adequate approximation of individual behavior, some others, for example, Allais in 1953, refuted the claim, and that is why we have the famous Allais paradox. A large number of experiments have since followed, exploring for alternative choice theories. For example, the Nobel Prize winners, the prospect theory of Kahneman and Tversky, 1979. Now I am going to another direction. That is the earlier we were talking about the utility theory. Okay, now coming to the market theory. There was an experiment by Chamberlain in 1948. Where you know Chamberlain. He was an American economist famous for the theory of monopolistic competition. That was published in 1933, the same year that John Robinson published the Economics of Imperfect Competition. In the theory of monopolistic competition, Chamberlain coined the term product differentiation, and in the Economics of Imperfect Competition, John Robinson coined the term monopsony. You know the meanings of all this, right? Monopsony, monopoly, and so on. Okay. Now, Chamberlain was the first one to attempt to create markets in the laboratory, applying methods that are still also used today in an enhanced form to conduct market experiments. In 1948, then he was in the Harvard University. Edward Chamberlain, organized a game with his students. The aim was to replicate the functioning of a market in perfect competition with the rational agents as closely as possible. Students were randomly assigned a card, which made each student either a seller or a buyer. In addition, that card displayed a price for a hypothetical good to be sold or bought. For students playing as sellers, this price referred to the minimum price at which they were ready to sell. For the buyers, this price indicated the maximum price they were willing to pay to obtain the hypothetical goods. After that, the students worked freely in the classroom and bargained with their colleagues to either buy or sell the goods. Once a deal had been made, the students came to Chamberlain's desk to report the price at which the goods had been sold. So this is the methodology. Now, the figure shows the theoretical market equilibrium. Okay, so in this framework, economic theory predicts outcomes according to the demand supply curves drawn based on the prices distributed to students. That is, how many students were willing to buy or sell at each possible price that appears on their card. So we have a downward sloping demand curve. This is the theoretical, okay, and an upward sloping supply curve. But the observed behavior in the Chamberlain experiment was like this. This shows the actual price. The actual price was fluctuating highly with a trend, with an upward trend, okay, with an increasing trend. Then this represented the average price. That is, this is the average price. No, sorry. So this is the moving equilibrium of the actual prices. Okay, that is why this is increasing. This is the moving equilibrium of the actual prices, and this represents the average price. Okay, average price is a constant one. And what is the perfectly competitive equilibrium price? That is given by this. This is the perfectly competitive equilibrium price, and the actual price, the average price, tended to be greater than the perfectly competitive market price. And that is why he argued that the actual market is not at all competitive one, rather it is an imperfect one, or we have imperfect competition in the market. So based on this graph, he argued that we cannot have a competitive market in general. What we observe is imperfect markets, imperfectly competitive markets. Because this is the competitive market price and this is the actual average price. The aim of his experiment was to prove that it could not at all be expected that market equilibria come about in markets. That is, we cannot have perfect market equilibrium. Chamberlain himself regarded the results he obtained as supporting his skepticism concerning these. Perhaps it is the assumption of a perfect market which is strange in the first place, according to Chamberlain. However, further development of his own method by Vernon Smith, who was his student and who who participated in the market experiment done by Chamberlain, and others later led to a convincing confirmation in the laboratory that even under difficult conditions, for example, in the case of very limited information, markets are indeed able to generate equilibrium prices. No matter how Chamberlain's findings are interpreted, his experiments are characterized by three things. First, they were carried out by an economist. Second, their objective was to experimentally test an equilibrium concept central to economic theory. And third, Chamberlain paid his subjects on the basis of their behavior in the experiment. That is, he used the incentives. It is presumably these three things that led many economists to view Chamberlain's experiments as the birth of experimental economics. Now we come to Smith, Vernon Smith, American economist, and he shared the Nobel Prize with Daniel Kahneman in 2002. And as I have already told you that he was one of Chamberlain's students and he participated in Chamberlain's classroom experiment. Around 15 years later, in 1962, Smith decided to replicate Chamberlain's experiment, but with the various changes in the environment, aimed at replicating what Smith thought were important actual driving forces of a competitive market. In his autobiography written for the Nobel Prize Committee, he said, in the autumn semester 1955, I taught principles of economics and found it a challenge to convey basic microeconomic theory to students. Why or how could any market approximate a competitive equilibrium? I resolved that on the first day of class, the following semester, I would try running a market experiment that would give the students an opportunity to experience an actual market, and me the opportunity to observe one in which I knew, but they did not know what were the alleged driving conditions of supply and demand in that market. So, as in Chamberlain's experiment, in his case also, each student received a card, making him either a buyer or a seller. This card also gave the student a reservation price, the price above which a buyer would not buy and below which a seller would not sell. The same as in Chamberlain's experiment. But he implemented certain changes. Instead of having bilateral bargaining or at most discussions in small groups between students, the announcements of offers and demands become public. That is, buyers and sellers could call out their offers in the room so that everybody could hear. This is aimed to make the information on prices public so as to mimic what is achieved by an auctioneer receiving and distributing all offers. That is the process that we call tatonement. That is the auction process. So he created a tatonement environment. Second, the market experiment was repeated over several periods, not just one period. as in Chamberlain's case, and allow the students to better understand the functioning of the market, hence getting closer to market behavior of professional market traders. And here we have the predicted and the observed behavior in the Smith replication of the Chamberlain experiment. The first one is the usual theoretical one, and so that we have the equilibrium price here, where the downward sloping demand and the upward sloping supply meet. This is the equilibrium price. So this is the equilibrium price. Now see, remember, he has done the selling experiment, selling and buying experiments in different periods. So over the periods, we find that the price approximates the equilibrium price, the actual price approximating the equilibrium price. So this is how Vernon Smith refuted his own teacher's claim and substantiated the perfectly competitive market mechanism. In 1976, he published Experimental Economics, Induced Value Theory in the American Economic Review. And 6 years later, all these principles were expanded in a book, Microeconomic Systems, not a book, article, Microeconomic Systems as an Experimental Science, published in the American Economic Review. However, the term experimental economics is believed to have been coined by a German economist, Heinz Schwarzman. He, together with his student, Reinhard Selten, who was a German economist, and Reinhard Selten shared the 1984 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics with John Nash and John Hassani for the significant contributions to experimental research on oligopolistic markets. So both the teacher and the students did the experiments in replicating oligopolistic markets in the classroom. In 1977, Schwarzman founded the German Society for Experimental Economics, the oldest scientific association of experimental economists in the world. In contrast to Chamberlain's market experiments, the oligopoly experiments of Schwarzman and Selten were characterized by game theoretical analysis. Two experiments in particular provide key examples, and this is in general with the experimental economics, that is the prisoner's dilemma and Allais paradox. Now I shall give you something about the prisoner's dilemma, the very basic one. Do I have time? Okay, anyway, I shall just go through this one because at least the prisoner's dilemma is very important. This is a standard example of a game analyzed in game theory that shows any two completely rational individuals might not cooperate, even if it appears that it is in their best interest to do so. That is the dilemma. They will not cooperate, even though cooperation is the best solution. It was originally framed by American mathematicians, as I told you earlier, Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher, while they were working at Rand Corporation. The Canadian mathematician Albert Tucker formalized the game, and he gave the name prisoner's dilemma. And he he designed the prison sentence rewards also. That is in a story form. The story is like this: two criminals, Alan and Ben. Just two names, A and B. Okay, Alan and Ben. They are arrested and imprisoned and kept in solitary confinement, so that they do not have any means of communicating each other. The prosecutors, in fact, lack sufficient evidence to convict the pair, Alan and Ben, on the principal charge. So they offer each prisoner a bargain. That is, each prisoner is given an opportunity to betray the other by testifying that the other committed the crime. The confessor can walk free and the other will go to jail for 15 years. That is the offer given by the prosecutors. Now, Alan and Ben each have two possible actions: either to remain silent or to confess. Hence, there are four possible outcomes of the game. Both are silent. Alan is silent, Ben also is silent. Then the second is Alan confesses and Ben is silent. Then Alan is silent and Ben confesses. Then both confess. So we have four possible outcomes like this. So we have a payoff matrix like this. We have Alan and Ben. We have four outcomes: silent or confess. Ben for Ben and silent or confess for Alan. Now the payoff for Alan and Ben are like this. For example, if both Alan and Ben are silent, then they each go to jail for 1 year for the crime. Going to jail is a bad thing, so their payoff is given in negative. -1 gives the negative utility and representing 1 year jail term if both are silent. Okay, if both prisoners confess, that is this case, then they will go for 10 years each. They will go to jail for 10 years each. That is -10, -10. Otherwise, if Alan is silent and Ben confesses, then Alan will get 15 years jail term and Ben can go free. On the other hand, if Alan confesses and Ben remains silent, Alan can go free and Ben will get 15 years jail term. So this represents the dilemma: to confess or not. That's the question. So this I have taken from that old classic dilemma. Okay, dilemma of, Hamlet. Clearly, if Alan and Ben could both remain silent, they could go to prison for only 1 year. But this is not, unfortunately, the equilibrium outcome. For Alan, the strategy confers strictly dominates the strategy silence. It is always best to confess, no matter what he expects Ben to do. That is, silence is the dominant strategy. So if Ben confesses, Alan thinks like this: if Ben confesses, it's the best for me to confess, since 10 years of jail is better than 15. If Ben remains silent.
Sorry for the intervention. Actually, we are supposed to end the session by 11:30.
Yeah, right.
Can you make it
faster? So maybe I shall stop here.
Yeah, you can
Right.
take 5 more minutes, sir.
5 more minutes. Okay.
Okay.
So then I shall finish this one. If Ben remains silent, it is still best for me, for Alan, to confess, since walking out free is better than 1 year jail. So thinks Alan. The same way Ben also thinks. That is the case. That is the problem. In the prisoner's dilemma, both players confess. So we get the Nash equilibrium as confess. In equilibrium, both prisoners go to jail for 10 years. And now one says, we go to prison for 10 years because we both confessed. If we hadn't confessed, we would each have got only 1 year jail, that is remaining silent. The others then says, yeah, but even if I had told you that I wouldn't confess, that is, even if there is a communication between them, you still would have confessed to go free, and I would have got 15 years jail. I'm glad I confessed. That is prisoner's dilemma. I think I shall stop here. If you have any doubt or something like that discussion, you can ask me. Anyway, I shall. Okay? Or do we have time for discussion or discussion? Like
Okay. Yeah, you can continue, sir. You can continue.
Continue for the.
Yeah.
Continue the slide.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So then I have only very few one. It's just over. Okay. The second one is the Allais paradox. Okay. This is a choice problem designed by Maurice Allais in 1953 to show an inconsistency of actual observed choices with the predictions of expected utility theory. What is the expected utility theory? This is a rational choice theory that rests on the notion, on the premise that given a choice under uncertainty, individuals will choose the option with the highest expected utility. Okay, so given a choice under uncertainty, individuals will choose the option with the highest expected utility. Now, the paradox starts with paradox is a classical hypothetical choice problem in behavioral economics that exposes human irrationality. Daniel Kahneman offered a simplified version of the puzzle in his seminal book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I have taken this from him. There are two problems, problem A and problem B. In problem A, we have two choices. There is 61% chance to win rupees 520,000 or 63% probability to win rupees 500,000. That is, in the first case, 5.2 lakhs. In the second case, 5 lakhs. But the probability for the first one is 61%. The second one is 63%. There is a risk of 2% difference. Okay. In probability. Similarly, in problem B, we have a 2% risk difference. 98% chance to win rupees 5.2 lakhs or 100% chance to win rupees 5 lakhs. So we have these two problems. Now, what happened in actual, or what happens in actual case, in general, okay, on an average, is this: majority of people choose the left hand option for problem A. That is the first one. 61% chance to win rupees 5.2 lakhs. And the right hand option for the problem B, that is 5 lakhs rupees with 100% chance. And Kahneman writes, if these were your preferences, you have just committed a logical sin and violated the rules of rational choice. Because the expected utility is not the same in both the cases. If the expected utility is not the same in both the cases, then the particular individual is irrational. The irrationality stems from the willingness to take on an additional 2% risk in exchange for an extra 20,000 rupees in potential winnings. Here I didn't change the Kahneman's dollar, okay, in Indian rupees. Potential winnings for one problem, but not the other. Put differently, we are risk seeking and choose the option with a greater expected value for problem A. But in the case of problem B, we are risk averse and choose the option with a lower expected value, despite the possible outcomes being of equal value for both problems. So that is why we say we have the Allais paradox. The individual under the uncertainty environment is not functioning rational. So there was a case study of Allais paradox among traders. In 2005, John List and Michael Haig of the University of Maryland ran an experiment to explore the susceptibility of traders to the Allais paradox. The researchers presented choice sets containing different hypothetical lotteries to futures and options traders from the Chicago Board of Trade. The traders exhibited a level of behavior consistent with the Allais paradox. However, they were less prone to the effect than a control group of undergraduate students. So I am stopping here with only this much. Besides the game theory, there are some other contributory sources to experimental economics. They include neural networks, artificial intelligence, cognitive psychology, and neurobiology. Artificial intelligence has an instrumental role by way of constructing computer systems capable of intelligent action and useful in experiments. Now there is one problem with the experimental economics, that is the Hawthorne effect. That is, the subjects under experimentation, if they are aware that they are under observation or experimentation, they tend to engage in affected behavior. That is, their behavior will not be the natural one, and this affected behavior will contaminate the experimental results, so that they cannot be taken as indicative of normal behavior. This is the Hawthorne effect, often plaguing the experimental economics. The only way to avoid such possibility is for the experimenter to try to keep the subjects from perceiving that they are subjects of experimentation. That is, don't tell them that this is an experiment and you are under observation. But such cases will have a lot of moral implications. So because of these ethical problems, this particular keeping the observation as secret cannot be done. For any of the reasons expressed above, economists have tended to avoid an experimental approach. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now is the time to ask questions. You can ask, you can unmute your mic and ask questions directly, or you can leave questions in the chat box also.
Sorry, I have taken a lot of time. No questions? If you have any question, you can ask tomorrow also.
Hello, participants, you can ask questions. Please ask if you have any doubts.
So,
ma'am, can we move on to vote of thanks? Hello, ma'am.
Yes, Mahin, but sir, if you want time to conclude, it can take 5 more minutes.
no, my part is already over. Now it is open for discussion.
Okay, okay, thank you.
If you don't have any doubts now, you can ask tomorrow also, right? That is, we are continuing experimental economics in terms of behavioral economics.
Okay, sir, may I ask you a question? Hello, sir.
Yeah, okay, you may ask.
Okay. As we all know, economics is mainly concerned with human behavior, which is highly unstable because human behavior changes from person to person and from time to time as well. Okay, so my question is it desirable to apply the experiments which has to be applied in a controlled environment like in physics, chemistry, etc., in economics? Is it desirable to apply such experiments in economics?
If you ask me personally whether it is desirable, I would say not perfectly. Okay, but that is not the contention by the experimental economists or the behavioral economists. According to them, it is possible. And see, for example, the experiment conducted by Smith in the classroom. Okay, the classroom is taken as a laboratory. So as far as possible, the most of the assumptions of perfectly competitive equilibrium also were assumed within the lab. And we have seen that the average price approximates the equilibrium price, okay, over the period. So that was a refutation of his own teacher's claim, in fact. So, but personally, I do not support these experiments. So that is my opinion.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Any other questions? Anybody? You can ask, please ask if you have any doubts.
Nobody coming forward?
Okay, Anthem ma'am, can we move on to the vote of thanks?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, now we reached the end of the session. Okay,
Somebody
so
was asking something?
yeah,
No? Okay.
yes, sir.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, now we are moving on to the last part of this session. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Anita V, professor and head and organizing secretary of this a workshop. Thank you, ma'am, for conducting such an informative workshop for us. Thank you so much. And next, I would like to thank Dr. Vijaya Mohanan Pillai, Honorary Fellow, Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, for presenting a very exhaustive, detailed, and very informative kind of presentation. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us for giving us such a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to thank Professor Manju S. Nair, Dean, School of Social Sciences, Kerala University. Thank you, ma'am. And I also thank all the other participants for making it convenient to attend this session. Thank you all.
I have just a note. I'm so sorry I missed one thing. That is at the outset itself, I should have expressed my gratitude to the organizers, especially Professor Anita, for inviting me to uh, this conference, and also for inviting me for the local colloquium. Yesterday also I just missed that. Sorry for that. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Anita ma'am, shall we move on to the next session?
Yes, but I think Saudamani ma'am couldn't join it. We will wait for a few minutes.
Okay, ma'am.
Hello. Dr. Anita?
Ma'am,
Yes.
are you okay now?
Yeah, yes, I'm okay now. And I hope we can continue. So can I
Okay.
start sharing my screen? I'm so sorry.
Yes. If you send to my mail, I will share it. Otherwise, you can also.
Okay. So should I think I can.
So shall we start, ma'am?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Good morning
Meera.
and welcome to the fourth technical session of the 3-day online international workshop organized by the Department of Economics, University of Kerala. I would like to welcome the key speaker of this session, Professor Saudamini Das from the Institute of Economic Growth, Dr. Anita B, Professor and Head of our department, Dr. Manju S. Nair, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences of our university. I would also like to welcome all the other faculty members of our department, research scholars, students, and all other participants who have joined us from other institutions. In this session, we are blessed to have Professor Saudamini Das, NABARD Chair Professor at the Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi, who would be talking to us on the topic Estimating Interdisciplinary Model in Ecological Economics Research. Professor Das received her PhD from the University of Delhi in 2009 and has been featured in the Nature Conservancy magazine on the mystery of mangroves, and the American Museum of Natural History has produced a movie based on her paper. She's a fellow of the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics, SANDI, and she was the Mailer Scholar of the Bejer Institute of Ecological Economics of the Royal Swedish Academy. Ma'am has published extensively with numerous journal articles, book chapters, working papers, and policy briefs to her credit. She has also submitted several research reports to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and the World Bank. In addition, she's also a reviewer of many respected journals, including World Development, Journal of Quantitative Economics, Climate Change Economics, Ecosystem Services, and so on. Then she's also a member of many professional associations like Center for Research on the Economics of Climate, Food, Energy, and Environment at the ISI New Delhi, the INSEE, or the Indian Society for Ecological Economics, and the European Association for Environmental and Resource Economists, familiar to us as ERE. Her areas of expertise include climate change adaptation, heat wave impact evaluation, loss and damage to livelihood from climate change, natural disaster and livelihood, natural disaster and natural buffers, ecosystem service valuation, coastal vulnerability, mangroves and ecosystem services. I know I've been a bit lengthy, but reading Saudamini ma'am's CV has been an inspiring experience, and I'm sure all others attending this session would also be inspired by her. With great respect and love, I invite you, ma'am, to deliver your address. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Meera. This is such a kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. I just want to switch up my video because I'm having some trouble from my side here. So I'm going to speak without my video. Please bear with me. Okay. So I don't know. How do I? Okay, so let me continue like this. So today I'm going to share some of my research on estimating interdisciplinary models in ecological economics research. All of us, like I don't know how many of the participants are interested in ecological economics, and those of you who are interested in ecological economics, I'm sure you will be motivated to go for more and more disciplines in your research. I hope you will be inspired after you see this presentation. So first of all, I'm going to tell you what is interdisciplinarity and why ecological economics is so much interdisciplinary, and what precautions you take when you try to estimate or when you try to do this type of research. Now, here I'm just trying to explain you what is interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is basically means when you use more than one discipline in a research. So like a combination of fields like economics, physics, geography, sociology, ecology, meteorology, anthropology in one study is called an interdisciplinary research. When the moment you use more than one, and it can be multiple, so then you do an interdisciplinary work. Ecological economics by nature is an interdisciplinary field because we try to study ecosystems, the nature's household and humanity's household, the economy. It is an intermixture of household behavior and that is impacting the economy. And we try to study different economic policies in such a way so that we try to minimize our impact on the ecology. So that is why the ultimate aim of ecological economics is to ensure human well-being, sustainability, and justice. So that means you are sustainable both from an environmental point of view, from ecology point of view, and also from economics point of view. So that is why by nature ecological economics is interdisciplinary. And whenever you do a research in ecological economics, you have to use more than one discipline. And unless you do it, then your results are not going to be unbiased, or you cannot get any pure result. Now, I'm going to give you some of these examples, and my presentation today are mainly based on these two papers. One is, mangrove can provide protection against wind damage during storm, which was published in Estuarian, Coastal and Self Sciences in 2013. And there is also one book chapter where I talk about the methodological and data challenges in estimating storm protection services. So, which is a book chapter in this particular book, Valuation of Regulating Services of Ecosystems, Methodology and Applications. So, the presentation is mainly based on these two, and if anybody is interested, then I can forward this to publications to you in future one. Now, let me start with this first example, that I did with Professor Kanchan Chopra, and this paper was published in Ecology, Economic and Political Weekly in the year 2013, where we try to see the trade-off between hydropower and conservation. This study was based on Himachal Pradesh, and over there, the government of Himachal Pradesh and also the central government, were having the many hydropower projects were being sanctioned in that region, and all of you would be knowing that the government of India is going more and more for green energy now. So in one such hydropower project, one particular lake was getting submerged, and that lake was also a part of the natural sanctuary in that particular state. And all of us know that Himachal Pradesh is very famous for tourism. And when you are submerging a particular lake, which is of lot importance to the tourists. Hello. Yeah. So please mute others. So we try to say, suppose we scrap this particular hydropower project, then what is the net benefit to the economy? So we try to see this intersectoral linkages between hydropower, industry, tourism sector, agriculture, forest ecosystem services, and the ultimate impact on per capita state domestic product. Now here, industry, per capita income, tourism, forest ecosystem, these are very much, part of economics now. We have data and you can do this. But the biggest challenge over here was, linking establishing a link between hydropower generation and industry, hydropower generation and tourism sector, hydropower generation and the agricultural sector likewise. Because when you say hydropower, that is the capacity expressed in terms of gigawatt, megawatt, this much will be produced. And then how do you convert those things into the power generation in a day, power generation in a month or in a year? Out of that power generation, what is the carrying capacity? What is the load factor? How much, if this is the capacity, how much is actually being produced? And how the power produced is being converted to power supply. So these things are the biggest challenges. So if you see this particular paper that is there in EPW, so at least now we have 2-3 pages in the appendix that talks about this type of equations, this type of derivations. So how do you convert? So we really had to study the electricity generation and how the electricity generation is converted into supply, and what is the link between generation and the supply to industry, generation and supply to the tourism or to agriculture. And then we are able to measure the impact of not producing or dropping one hydropower project on the impact on the industry or impact on the tourism sector or impact on the agricultural sector. And then from there, we try to measure how the state per capita domestic product will be affected if this particular power project is dropped. And then if we conserve the lake, how much more income the state is going to get from tourism, whether that income is compensating for the drop in domestic product because of the drop in the power sector. So these are the things, these are the challenges that one has to see unless you study the electricity generation and know how the supply and the production are connected to each other. So I think this type of study is difficult to do. So this is one challenge we try to do that. Then, this is another one. I'm taking it from some other example. I mentioned the source over here. So here, the groundwater and society and the issues and how the groundwater is a big issue right now. In most part of the country, like this in India, we have the groundwater is getting depleted. And if you want to study how the societal behavior is affecting the groundwater or how the groundwater can be conserved, can be optimally used, so many things needs to be studied. Like you can see number one, you have to first define meaning and interpretation of water, groundwater. Then land, surface, and groundwater related governance and power relationships. So like we have some policies for water, surface water, but or for the land water, but we do not have any such policies for groundwater. Somewhere because you really cannot define what part of groundwater is belonging to whom. So then governance also comes to play. And the most important over here is the geophysical and biochemical processes. So how much it rains and what is the climatic change. And once you have the surface water, how the surface water is seeping to groundwater. So the nature of the aquifers, their elevation, their extent, the soil and the rocks present over there. So because they are the ones who are playing a very crucial role in percolation. So unless you study this aspect, it's very difficult to make any regional study on the groundwater. And then ultimately the resource use and exchange pattern at local scale, depth, at distance, mediated with technology, who is using what type of technology. So unless you take these multiple things in account, it's very difficult to study groundwater. In ecology, in environmental economics, we study, that we say the forest are providing us the groundwater recharge. They provide moisture. So to do this, I think we also need to study this type of things. How the forest ecosystem is helping in percolation. What is the root structure? How the nature of the soil and nature of the rock over there are helping in the percolation. This is all highly interdisciplinary. You want to study human behavior, and at the same time, you have to link the human behavior to nature's behavior. Unless you do this, I think it's difficult to get a very conclusive and usable result. And similarly, when you talk about water quality and sustainability, so you have to do an engineering analysis, health analysis, social analysis. I think multiples are n number of multiples you can get from the internet from different studies, how different disciplines are used in doing an interdisciplinary or ecological economics research. Now, let me come to the topic that I'm going to discuss with you today. So mangroves and storm protection, and I'll tell you how I estimated these models. Now, this particular image I have taken from Costanzas and others publication in 2021 in Global Environmental Change. And you can see here, suppose there is a cyclone coming, and because of the cyclone, the people living in that area are being affected, and you want to measure the damage to the GDP or lives lost or damage to properties, etc. And between the habitation and the sea, there is this patch of the mangroves, and you will try to see how the mangroves are mediating the effect of the storm on the habitation. So then to do this, first of all, you have to study the cyclone behavior. So how the cyclone, this is called a storm speed, how the storm is moving. If the storm is a very slow one, then it is becomes more and more powerful. So the speed of the storm. Then the wind speed is the circular wind in the cyclone. Then the source level, because of the cyclone, how sea has been elevated. Sea level elevation will be depending on the bathymetry of the area. Then you study the coastal topography, whether the coastal area is plain or it is elevated. And after that, you will study the nature of the habitation. What is the extent of the habitation? What is the what are the other features? Whether it's dense or not very dense. What is the height and what is the root structure? So you have to study the nature of the vegetation, and then you will be coming to the habitation, human habitation. So the type of people, the type of property, etc., and also the governance structure. So unless you take all these different things into account, I think it's very difficult to measure the storm protection services of the mangroves. So you have to study metallurgy, you have to study the topography of the region or the geography of the region, you have to study botany, because that is how you can study the forest features, and then you will come to socioeconomics, the economic behavior. Now here I try to say here, suppose first of all you have to study storm features. Now what are the storm features? What is the wind speed? What is the storm surge? How much it is raining per day or during the cyclone period, time of the occurrence, whether what time it came, whether it was in the daytime, evening time, night time, or during the harvest season or during a very slack season. So these things do matter if you want to study about the protection behavior, the potential, the damage potential of the storm. Then on the coastline, you have to study bathymetry. Bathymetry means the elevation of the seabed. If it is very shallow, then you get a high storm surge. If it is very deep, then you do not get a high storm surge. Topography of the region, whether how it is elevated, whether it is rocky or plain or only sandy beaches, and hydrology of the area, how many rivers are there. If there are not many rivers coming over there, then maybe the water will get carried away by the rivers. And coastal barriers, then like mangrove or like the salt marshes or any other type of wetland, and then the features of that coastal barriers. So you can see here, mangrove is only one factor, and there are so many other intervening factors. Then people and the properties, nature of the habitat, coastal distance, socioeconomics, government response, infrastructure. So not many things you need to take into account when you want to study the storm protection of the mangroves. As you can see here, you have some 20 different variables, out of which only mangrove is one variable, and then also mangrove features do matter. So now, when you study this type of study, what are the challenges? Mainly there are 3 to 4 challenges that you face in estimating such a model. One is understanding the theories and interlinkages. Suppose you want to combine metallurgy to human behavior. So then you have to really study how a storm is being formed. So what is the storm behavior? What is the structure of a storm? And similarly, if you want to link physics to human behavior, or how the mangroves are protecting or breaking the wind speed or breaking the storm surge, then you also have to study different type of theories, at least the theories which are relevant to your study. And then you should be able to link the theories. Okay, this is how it is being formed, and this is how my model. Your model should be able to link those theories to your variables. Then convergence of the theories. So if you are using 3 or 4 different theories, then you should be able to converge those so that you are able to take account of these different theories in your model. That are data challenges. Like in economics, we use economic data, which are either time series, cross section, or panel data. Mostly we are linked and we are familiar with those data. But in other disciplines, like in science, say in physics or chemistry, you don't deal with the time series data. Basically, you deal with the parameters, because the structures or the models are like that. When you change the parameters, then your models also will change. So you should be able to use those parameters and see how those parameters can be linked to your model. In geography, you use a GIS data, geographical information system, or you use remote sensing data. So these are the different data, and you have to really see how those different type of data can be compared or can be collapsed to a common usage. So that's what you have to do. Then scale and periodicity. In economics, our unit of analysis can be one individual or a particular, maybe a village or a block or a district or a state. Likewise, we have different scale. But in case of GIS remote sensing, you have to define it. You cannot do this at an individual level. I know you can you do it only at a specific geographical scale. So this also you have to see, if you are doing this study, then what should be your scale of analysis, because you have to use different types of data in your model. And periodicity, whether you have annual data, some data is available daily, some data, like those of us who are doing the climate science, we can use daily data or one hourly data, so temperature, so rainfall or humidity. These are the frequencies very different. But if you talk about the national income, per capita income, then you can have it only at annual level. There are some data which is available at the monthly or at a weekly variation. So then you have to, but in case of remote sensing or GIS data, you can see variation only in say maybe after 10 years or so. I studied the coastal erosion in Gujarat. So for coastal erosion, you can visualize this erosion only if you have a duration of 10 years to 15 years, because these are very slow changing variable. You are not able to see those variations very frequently. So your variation can either be 10 years or 15 years. And accordingly, you also have to change your other economic data so that the GIS data or the remote sensing data can be compared to your economic data. So this you have to really find out at what scale and at what periodicity your model can be estimated. And then after that, you come out to the all econometric issues, estimation issues, that typically we face in economics. So this is how there are multiple issues that you have to deal with when you estimate an econometric one interdisciplinary econometric model. Okay, so now let me say, like I studied do mangrove provide wind protection, and I studied this particular cyclone that came to Orissa in October 99, and you can see here, you see the cyclone, the wind is moving anti-clockwise, you can see here, and then there is a spot inside which is called the eye of the cyclone. So now this really matters. If we're using a cross-section data to measure the storm protection of mangroves from the cyclone, then you really have to see what is the cyclone structure and a different structure, and what is the size of the eye, because eye is a silent region. So at one moment, the eye may not be having any wind, but before that region is coming, but the eye region usually get wind from two different directions. So you have to treat the eye region differently than the non-eye region. Unless you study cyclone in detail, using a cross-section data to analyze cyclone behavior becomes very, very difficult. Okay. So when I did this, so I took lessons in meteorology for nearly 15 to 20 days with my meteorology friends. Then they explained me how a cyclone behaves and what is the structure of wind in different part of the cyclone, and what is then they put the cyclone into 4 different quadrants. In which quadrant what is the wind direction and what is the damage potential, and you have to put your study area into those quadrants to measure the damage, the potential of damage, and what role mangroves can flow. So let me come to that in course of time. So here I give you this example, storm structure. So you can see here the blue part is this is one part, the red part, and then the yellow part. So these are the different storm structure. In different structure, the wind velocity is very different, and there are different cyclone models that can tell you in which part what is going to be. Any meeting, can you talk to you after the half an hour? Yeah, thank you. So you have to study the storm structure and then see how the wind is different, and for this you can get parameters from the meteorology model to measure the wind. So this is how they say, like This is about the eye of the storm, then wind velocity increases, reaches a maximum, and then goes down. So that means the moment you're away from the cyclone eye area, then the wind velocity should be decreasing. At what rate it decreases also depends on which region you are. For a Indian Ocean region, there is a different parameter. For the Pacific Ocean region, there is a different parameter. So these things also you need to know if you want to use your meteorological model in your economics model. Okay. So this is, and here you can see these are the 4 different quadrants. So in the first quadrant, usually the damage potential is very, very high because you are getting both the storm surge and also the wind velocity, which is entering from sea to the region. In the second quadrant, the wind is coming from the interior area to the sea. So here you have less damage. So also in the third quadrant, but it is usually in the first and the fourth quadrant that you have very high damage potential of the storm. So you have to see your study area is falling in which region so that you are able to measure it. Okay. Now, this is what this is the, suppose this is the landfall region of, I think giving a lesson in meteorology, and suppose the storm is made a landfall over here, then you can draw circles, and in each circle, the wind velocity is the same. So if a village is over here or a village is over here or over here, they all would be getting a different wind velocity. But as you go away from the landfall point, the wind velocity decreases. So that means in this circle, the wind velocity will be much higher compared to this circle, and wind velocity will be much higher in this circle compared to this circle. And you can measure this potential wind velocity from the cyclone model. And once you know, suppose there is a village over here and you can measure the potential wind velocity, so you can find out what is the potential of these houses being damaged. So this is how special variation in the cyclone impact, which can be measured by the cyclone wind velocity, and this you can do only when you are using a meteorological model in your economic research. Okay, maybe I can just give a little bit later on. Now, so this is the one model I used in my study that came out in Estuarine, Coastal and Self Sciences. So here, so these circles are the wind direction of the storm, and A is the landfall point of the. Suppose at this point, this blue line is the coastline. Suppose the cyclone made a landfall at this point, and I want to measure the damage in the village C. There is a village over here. I want to measure the damage over here. So now for that, what all I need to take into account? So I need to take into account, and damage comes mainly because of 2 things. One is velocity of the wind and velocity of the storm surge, which I define here as wind energy and energy from the surge. Okay. So now, and the wind is energy in this particular village. So from this particular circle, and this circle, and here is a model that says, you can see here. So I define this as a Vmax, that is the maximum wind velocity during the landfall. And then these are the different parameters. Okay, so D is the distance of the village from the landfall point, and R is the radius of the cyclone. And then mu is one parameter that you get from the meteorology that says, okay, this mu is defined for different region, and because my study was for the Indian Ocean region, so I took the mu value which was nearly 0.5 for the Indian Ocean region, and then the wind velocity decreases exponentially. This is a theory we also studied from meteorology, and then there are 2 different parameters that can decrease the wind. One is the distance from the coast, and then M is the width of the mangrove. And this parameter is lambda. Suppose you can say as coastal distance increases by 1 kilometer, wind velocity will decrease by minus delta. So this delta, and if wind width of the mangrove is increasing by 1 kilometer, then the wind velocity will decrease by delta. So lambda and delta are the 2 parameters I wanted to estimate in this particular study. Okay, and then the other energy is coming from the storm surge. So for the storm surge, we try to measure sea elevation. What was the elevation of the sea, and what are the different points from where storm surge can enter the village, and which is the point giving the maximum storm surge. So you really have to, like, B is a point, D is a point, A is a point, from where the village can get storm surge. Because B is very close to the village, obviously the village will get maximum storm surge from B. So we have to see what was the elevation at point B, what was the elevation at point T, and how storm surge is coming to the village, and when it reaches, the village is getting maximum storm surge from here. Okay, and these different parameters, alpha and eta, these all I could get from the theory, from the literature. But in my study, because there is we studied the wind protection function of the mangroves for the first time, and this was the first study we studied this. So we tried to measure the value of lambda and delta. Okay, so in this particular study, multiple disciplines were used. This is the equation. Ultimately, I define my damage, which is a function of beta times. This is the velocity or the energy of the wind. This is the energy coming from the storm surge, and this is how we try to measure this one. Okay, and here is a parameter rho. So this parameter was again taken from the theory. I'll just come to some of these parameters here. So here, what all theories are used? I use meteorology. That the cyclone structure, what is the area of the eye, what is the outer eye region. So in terms of the radius, let's say from 25-kilometer radius area was the eye region. And 200-kilometer area was affected by the cyclone. So beyond 25 kilometers, the areas were called the outer eye region. Estimates of cyclone parameters, cyclone path and duration, wind direction, surge direction, damage potential of landfall quadrant. All these things I had to take from meteorology. So there are so many different publications related to this particular cyclone, and also the instruction from different meteorologists I had to use to get these different parameters so that I can measure the wind velocity and how the potential wind velocity decreases as you move away from the cyclone. And there was the atmospheric science. So tangential wind model of the cyclone, atmospheric parameters of the North Indian Ocean region, wind forcing. So these are the different things that I took from the atmospheric science and use those to measure the wind velocity. Studied a little bit of oceanography because I wanted to know how the sea was elevated at the coast during the cyclone. So for that I used the oceanography. Then I took the model from the oceanography department of IIT Delhi and also IIT Kharagpur, and then I used the storm surge model that they had developed. Sea elevation at the coastal points. So this is the input I took from the oceanography department of these two different IITs. Then I used some amount of physics because we wanted to see if we wanted to convert the surge impact in terms of wind impact, because you wanted to measure everything in terms of wind velocity per hour. So for that, when the storm surge is breaking at the coast, so it is the potential energy which is being converted to kinetic energy. So for that, we also wanted to study the energy conversion rule. So how much is the potential energy, and when it is converted to kinetic energy, how the energy is getting converted, what is the parameter? So then potential energy is the sea elevation. Suppose the sea is elevated by 5 meters. So in 5 meters, how much water is being stored? And then when it is breaking into the sea, how that is going to cause a different type of velocity of the storm surge. So that we have to use the energy conversion rule for that. Hydrology, for carrying capacity of the rivers, small rivers, big rivers, what is their capacity, how they are located from the habitation. Geography, coastal topography, elevation, land use and land cover, remote sensing, composites. Mangrove forest features, what is I think the different structure of the trees, because we wanted to define one parameter that defines the mangrove health. So good health means better protection. To define mangrove health, you have to use the height of the tree, the canopy cover, the perimeter of the trunk, etc. So using that, we define a mangrove health feature. Then we come to socioeconomics, demography, population feature, social structure, whether scheduled caste people are treated well or not, what is their behavior in the cyclone shelters. So the equation between the different caste group, developmental indicators, whether the village has a road or not, whether the village had cyclone shelters or not, how far was the village from a metallic road, political features, whether the, because Tehsildar is the one who takes care of all the elevation and evacuation and other rescue activity during a disaster. How efficient was the Tehsildar, and what is the equation, the nature of the political party, whether they are in conflict with each other or they were in conformity with each other. Likewise, this also plays a role. Econometrics, what model you have, and what model whether you can use because for human death I used a Poisson model, for house damage I used a regression model, OLS model. So what type of data you have, what models you can use. So then once you decide the model, then you have all the parameters. How do you predict the values? And then ultimately you do the economic analysis, do the valuation and the cost benefit analysis. So to reach an economic outcome, you have to take so many different disciplines into account, and you have to take input from different disciplines. So this is what we do. Like before we could estimate the model, I spent nearly more than 1 year in learning these different disciplines and trying to use what parameters are useful to me and what parameters I can use and what are the optimal values of these parameters for my model, keeping my the region into account, the type of economic development in that area, etc. Okay. So this is how I did. Then I collected data, and then I came to estimation. So in this study, I estimated two different model hypotheses. One is that tangential wind velocity declines exponentially relative to potential wind velocity as the wind moves away from the coast. So that means here I try to say that as the cyclone is moving away from the coast, that means the villages which are close to the coast receive a higher wind velocity compared to villages which are away from the coast, and how this wind velocity decreases per kilometer of the coastal distance. And second was that wind barriers on the coast, such as mangrove, further accelerate the rate of decline of the tangential wind. So these two parameters, which in my equation I define as a delta and eta. So these two I try to estimate in my model. Initially, what I did, my identification strategy was that I assume this lambda and delta. This lambda is the decline of the wind velocity because of coastal distance, and delta is the decline of the wind velocity because of the kilometer of the mangrove. I assume this to be 0, and then simulate house damage under the assumption, and then I compare that to the actual damage. And if there is any difference, then I try to measure the value of these two parameters from that model. So this is where we got the data from, like socioeconomic data we got from these bundles, but for other data we have to use the models or from the meteorology department or from the IIT Delhi and IIT Kanpur. So this is the study area. So I drew hundreds of circles like this, and for each circle I try to measure at 1 kilometer distance. I try to draw a circle, and then I try to measure the potential wind velocity, and then I see which village is on the which circle. And accordingly, I could measure the potential wind velocity on that village. Okay, and depending on the potential wind velocity, I try to see what is the potential damage of that area, because we had the data on the house damages and other things, and also the meteorology department says if this is the wind velocity, this is the potential damage, this much percentage of the kacha structure will be damaged, this percentage of the pakka structure will damage. So using that parameters, so we measured potential wind velocity and the potential damage, and then we compare that to the actual damage. But before that, we wanted to bring in the cyclone structure into our study area, because inside the eye area, so you can see here, so this small circles are the villages, the small circles squares are the gram panchayat. So here you have the data at the gram panchayat level, and here you have data at the village level. Okay, and then you have the block boundary, district boundary, and this is the cyclone. Cyclone made a landfall here, went this way, was stationary over here for some time, and then turned back. So this area received maximum damage when the cyclone was in this particular track. Okay, the area under the eye, this was the eye radius of this cyclone is 25 kilometers. So we draw this line. So in this particular area, no mangrove can provide any protection because the wind direction is anti-clockwise as well as clockwise. So this area should be typically be excluded when we measure the storm protection value of the mangroves. So we excluded this area. And then this is because the cyclone is stationary over here. So we thought maybe some areas will be receiving maximum wind velocity from here. Suppose these villages received maximum wind velocity when the cyclone was here. Obviously, they cannot be protected by the mangroves because mangroves are at the coast. So you have to, so all these villages and the Gram Panchayats will try to measure from which area they got the maximum wind, whether from the coastal distance or when the cyclone was at this point. So accordingly, we thought, okay, these red ones are the ones, these are the ones which cannot be protected by the mangroves because they might receive maximum wind velocity when the cyclone was stationary in the interior region. Whereas these areas received maximum wind velocity during the landfall of the cyclone, so they can be protected. And accordingly, we try to compare the potential damage to actual damage only for black colored villages or the Gram Panchayats. So much of details and nitty-gritty has to be kept in mind when you do a evaluation of an ecosystem service by the mangrove. So then, and if you remember, suppose I had taken one row parameter, so I can just put the permission here. So this is the model, my damage model, and here is the parameter called rho. So this rows, this is the value. Usually the theory says the damage potential, the damage is proportional to square of the wind velocity. That means the value of the beta, this is a proportion, and this basically depends on rho, which is equal to 2 square. But we never know because this value is defined for the developed region. So I was advised that okay, maybe because you are talking about the developing region where the houses are very low quality, so you should also try different values of the rho. So we took the rho value to be 1.5 and also 2, and then you try to see what is the expected damage and what is the actual damage. And in this, then we put also the area into different wind velocity, region. So you can see here, this is the potential damage can be in between 90 to 100%, and actual damage was actually 100%. And 54 or 50 is the number of villages in that particular wind bracket. Okay, so I divided the study area into different ranges of wind velocity, and then from there I did the comparison of the expected damage. This expected damage was measured keeping the potential wind velocity in mind. So you can see here that this is a much more detail here. So you can see here if the wind velocity is more than 201 km per hour, then if this is the rho value, then 73% of the houses will be damaged, 65% will be damaged. Then I said, what is the actual damage? So in this particular range, there were no mangroves in my area. So the villages without mangrove, this was the percentage of houses getting damaged, and there are no villages. Okay, now you can see here, I have two different, this is the one that compares the damage potential both because of wind and storm surge, and these two other columns that says percentage of actual damage only due to wind, and this is the damage both due to wind and storm surge. So this is much more accurate. Okay, and again here you can see here if the wind velocity is in between 186 to 201 km per hour, then we expect 65% to 73% of the houses, kacha houses being damaged. So then when you compare this, the villages without mangrove, 72% were damaged, whereas in case of villages with mangrove, only 50% houses were damaged. And potentially, we need, 65 to 73, that means potential damage is matching with the damage of the villages without mangrove. This potential damage is not matching with the damages having a mangrove. You can see the difference over here. So first of all, we proved that okay, for a region like Orissa, the rho value should be 1.5, not 2. The 2 is we say that damage potential is proportional to square of wind velocity, but that is applicable only for the developed region. For the developing countries where we have a lot of kacha structure, so this is actually equal to 1.5. That means the cyclones are more damaging than they are in case of developed region. So then, this particular line tells you the potential damage for different wind velocity range. This one tells you the damage for villages without mangrove, and this one tells you the damages for the same wind velocity but having mangrove. And you can see here everywhere there is a difference. Here it is 72 versus 50, 65 versus 50, 51 versus 46, 45 versus 40. And only in this area, because the mangroves are highly damaged and patchy, so we saw a little, 2% more damage in mangrove areas. In other regions, the non-mangrove areas had much higher damage than the mangrove areas. And these damages are all matching with the potential damages that you are expecting. Okay. So this is then when you plotted these things, you can see clearly, this is the damage potential for different wind velocity for villages without mangrove, and this is the damage potential or damage of villages with mangrove. So this gap is, definitely the wind protection provided by the mangroves to the villages or the houses in that region. And you can see here, as the wind velocity or the cyclone impact is much stronger, the gap is also much higher. If the cyclone impact is not so strong, say 118 kilometer or 132, then there is not much difference, because the cyclone is not, very damaging. So obviously the mangroves are not providing you protection. But when the cyclone becomes more and more damaging, then the gap is also widening. So it means that mangroves, along with the storm surge, also provide protection from the cyclone wind. Then using this data, we try to measure the value of the parameters. So to that also we did a location-wise comparison. Villages within 25 kilometers, 28 kilometers, 30 kilometers. Likewise, we did the villages, and then also we did this comparison. And you can see here, then in that case also, this is the radial distance from the landfall. Earlier comparison was with respect to wind velocity, and this okay. These were with respect to the radial distance. And you can see hello, please mute yourself. So here again, you can see here in these different distances also, you can see there is a difference. Actual average house damage per villages. So you can see here, this is villages with 10 kilometers from coast, villages from 10 to 20 kilometers from coast, and the villages 20 to 30 kilometers, 30 to 40 kilometers. In this case, we try to see whether the mangrove is protecting only villages close to it or villages also away from it. So you can see here that if you see the this is a comparison. So there are no mangroves here, and here there is a mangrove. So this is the damage per villages kilometer, and this is the villages in each. Sorry, let me tell you comparison. So you see the color. So in this range, this is the villages. There are no mangrove over here. Average width of the mangrove. So in this case, you do not make any comparison. But in this case, there are 0 mangrove and 1.6 kilometer width of the mangrove. For the same distance and for the wind velocity, 88% houses were damaged in no mangrove, and 71% were damaged in the mangrove protected villages. So this difference, you can say, is because of the presence of the mangrove. So this is within 10 kilometers. Similarly, within this is 20 to 20 kilometers. This is 20 to 30 kilometers, and this is 30 to 40 kilometers. And here also you see, though these are the different spatial comparisons, you can see how there is a difference. In many of these cases, you can see the villages with 0. If this figure is 0 here, 0 here, 0 here, and you can see there is also a difference. 0 mangrove is having more damage, and positive mangrove is having less damage. And similarly, also here, 0 mangrove is for 34 and 37. In many cases, they are not. The mangrove is not showing protection because the mangroves were all protected. But if you see here, 17 to 3, 18 to 8, 13 to 7, 9 to 12, 13 to 50, likewise. So in many cases, because the mangroves are patchy, and wherever we had an intact mangrove, we could see that the mangrove is protecting as far as, from the landfall point to 82, we went from landfall point to 82 kilometers, and horizontally, and also from coast to 40 kilometers vertically. So you can see here the evidence of mangrove protecting the villages in different regions as well. Okay, so this is my last slide. So here, then using these different differences, I try to measure the value of these parameters. So this is the parameter. This tells you what is the decrease in wind velocity as you move towards from the coast. You go in interior. So beyond 10 kilometers of the coast, this says for areas without mangrove, the decay was 0.01, whereas for areas with mangrove, the decay was 0.02. So that means this was higher. So that says if you have mangrove, the wind velocity decreases as you go from the coast to the interior region, and this the rate of decay is by this particular rate, say 1% for every 1 kilometer interior distance non-mangrove areas, and whereas it decreases by 2% if you have mangrove in the coast. That means the cyclonic wind decreases as you go interior, and this decreases at a faster rate if you have mangroves on the coast. Okay. And then you said, what if the mangrove width increases, how much the decrease in the wind velocity? So this delta parameter came around 0. That means around by 10%, which is a very, very high value. So this was 10% in high impact zone to 26% in low impact zone. Obviously, because in the low impact zone, the cyclone is not having a low impact, and then because the mangroves are also breaking the wind velocity, so the rate of decline is 26% in low impact zone and by 10% in high impact zone. For every one increase in 1 kilometer width of the mangrove decreases the cyclonic wind velocity by 10% in high impact zone and by 26% in the low impact zone, which are very, very strong factors. Say, along with decreasing the storm surge, mangroves also decrease the wind velocity of the storm. Okay, and then we try to measure this protection of the mangrove to house damage in terms of economic value. That came around 1,000 rupees per family, or around 27 hectares per year in 99 prices. These are the valuations we did. And using this valuation also, we did some simulation, cost benefit analysis, which I'm not going to show you over here, but at least one strong conclusion that came out from this study was that mangroves provide wind protection, and this is not localized. Beneficiaries are also people living far away from the coast, and this is the first study that was able to prove using so many different disciplines that mangrove storm protection is not limited only to storm surge. This is also, they also provide protection from the cyclonic wind. So this is that means this is a very strong reason to protect and use mangroves in disaster management. So this study, I did when I was doing I got the Mellor Scholarship, and I was there at the Bayer Institute. So this study, in fact, I owe to Professor Carl Gulan Mellor. So, and he also had contributed a lot in building this model. And I owe, ideally, I'm very grateful to Professor Mellor and the people at the Institute for this particular paper, and also to help me to develop this interdisciplinary, things. And thank you all very much for giving me this chance and, listening to me. So I stop sharing here.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we have the session is open for discussion. Participants can unmute themselves and ask their doubts, or you can leave some comments in the chat box. I'll read them out for ma'am.
So here, I think the biggest challenge when you do an ecological economics research is that how you play out, how you describe your model, and how you describe the interdisciplinarity, how the different disciplines are linked to each other. Unless you are able to do it, I think, then estimating this model and doing this work becomes very difficult. Yeah.
Any questions? Ma'am, if I may ask a question.
Yeah, please. Yes, please.
Ma'am, I'm doing research in the interface of climate change and financial stability. So my main concern is how climate change affects financial stability and the balance sheets of financial institutions, especially in a rapidly changing climate. There is a higher risk of extreme weather events recurring over the years. So the value at risk is high in the case of banks which have exposures in terms of loans, and for insurers as well, they do have huge exposures in terms of building insurance, vehicle insurance, and so on. So, ma'am, you have modeled the climate, the impact of storm surges. So similarly, how can we model the impact of certain floods or certain such cyclones and extreme weather events on financial, like the financial books of the companies? For example, ma'am, similar to what you had said, like the buildings that are prone to be affected, if you could just give me an idea as to that.
The challenge over here is, getting a proper estimate of the premium, because when they're giving insurance to cover to houses or other different type of assets, like we have the crop insurance now, right?
Yes,
So measuring the premium is the most crucial thing, and in measuring that premium, I think this interdisciplinarity will come into picture, because suppose they are going, so let's take the case of crop insurance. Okay, so here what is the interdisciplinary agricultural behavior? And first is that how frequently the extreme events are, what extreme events are covered in your insurance. Suppose it's the flood or cyclone or a hailstorm or something else. So then they have to see the cyclonic factor, the meteorology factor here is the frequency of these extreme events, the timing of these extreme events, and in the severity, how severely they're occurring in that particular area.
Okay.
This is one. Then and what is the damage portion, the time of the year that they are coming, and what type of crop, and which crop is more sensitive to what type of damage. Suppose flood comes, maybe some particular paddy or something will be partially damaged, but if it is rabi crops or some other crops, they may be completely damaged. So this is another interdisciplinarity that comes into picture over here. You have to see the potential or the likelihood of these different type of crops getting damaged. Okay. And so this interdisciplinary comes from different angles you have to see here, and accordingly the premium can be measured. And if the frequency, and then suppose the frequency, if the farmers are going for those crops which are more likely to be damaged, obviously that is going to hamper the financial liability of the insurance companies.
Okay, ma'am.
And if you talk about the house, suppose the banks are giving loan for infrastructure or for houses or infrastructure or for a particular say electricity department. So then they have to see how this infrastructure is being constructed, this concept of resilience infrastructure. If that is not taken into account, then obviously that is going to affect the financial liability of the banks who are giving loan for developing the infrastructure. So this concept of resilience infrastructure was not there before, maybe 10-15 years, but now this is coming more and more.
Yes,
like government of Orissa did, when they developed a bus stand, because they, for the car festival, I think that was in the year 2012. And they developed a beautiful bus stand, taking loan from the banks and all that. Then after I think within 1 year, one storm came and the entire bus stand was completely damaged.
Okay.
Because they did not keep, the cyclone frequency of that area in mind when they designed the structure. So it should have been climate resilient, at least cyclone resilient. It was not. So obviously it was a huge, liability on the financier as well as on the state government. So this concept of resilience also has to come in mind. Maybe you can take some of these examples and see how, without keeping climate resilience in mind, what is the resilience structure and how the resilience structure is being defined, what parameters should be kept in mind when you define a resilience structure, and whether the banks are giving loan to resilient structure or non-resilient structures. Then obviously financial liability will be more affected if they are giving loan to non-resilient structures.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and similarly for the insurance companies also, what type of crops or what type of things they are insuring.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, so that I think in your study, it's the concept of resilience, and that again is defined keeping different disciplines keeping in mind. It really has to factor in your model.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Excuse me, ma'am. I have a doubt.
Sure, please.
Ma'am, I'm doing my research on topic coastal erosion and human deprivation in Kerala. So I have a doubt regarding, I would like to calculate the coastal erosion rate of 2 years. That is 30 years, 1991 and 2021.
Okay.
Is it possible to calculate the severity of erosion, coastal erosion by taking this 2 years in order to understand the damage? Okay,
Yes.
and then how can I calculate this coastal erosion between these 2 years, 1991 and 2021?
Yeah. So basically, you have to either you can use the satellite images for that particular specific region for these 2 years, because satellite images are very easily available now. So there are some of them, I think for the earlier years you can get it free also. If you have any link, if you know anybody in the remote sensing organization, either Kerala remote sensing organization or the remote sensing in Hyderabad, NRHS.
Okay,
so you should be able to get the satellite image, and from the satellite image you will be able to draw the coastline. Because when I studied coastal erosion in Gujarat, I did exactly that. I studied it for 1990 and then 2013. So that was again a gap of 13 years. For 2 point of time, because unless you have 23 years, unless you have a gap of 20 to 25 years, it's very difficult to demarcate the change. Okay, because this is a very slow moving variable. So you, for these 2 different years, you take the satellite image, then draw the coastline, and then you can easily, when you superimpose these 2 maps, then you can see what part of the coast has changed from erosion or accretion. If the coastal area has increased, then you can define as accretion. If the coastal area has gone inside, then it is called erosion. So you can easily measure the erosion, yes, in terms of square kilometer or hectares. You can easily do that. It's very easily doable. And once you do that, then this is the, suppose you find out these many hectares has been eroded in this, and then you have to see the coastal length in a 10 kilometer or 20 kilometer coastal distance. What is the total area you can find out. So once you find out, then you can see what is the rate of change, because this is yours is 20 years difference, right, or 21 years.
Ma'am, I would like to take 30 years difference.
20 years. No? Okay, so for 20 years you can easily measure. If you compare these 2 coastline, you take the satellite image, then you draw the coastline, and obviously you have to take the help from a person who is very acquainted with the remote sensing data. Because I myself could not do that. I had to take help from those remote sensing person who are specialized. This is where interdisciplinary comes. And then you superimpose these 2 maps on each other, and then you can easily detect the changes. So the changes can either be erosion or it can be accretion. So because your interest is erosion, then you measure the a kilometer or square kilometer eroded, and then you find out the erosion per year. Divide that change by 20. Then you can measure how much on average the coastline of Kerala or that particular region is eroding per year.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, this is a very easily doable, but you need to have remote sensing data for those 2 years and some expert who can help you to interpret that data.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. So anything, any environmental issues you take up, any ecological issues you take up, you really have to have a different, even though you want to find out, suppose you did the erosion study, you measure the rate of erosion per year, and then you also try to explain it, why it is happening, why in one area you have more erosion, why in another area you have less erosion, and then you can explain it in terms of economic activity, or in terms of population pressure, or in terms of maybe in one area the coastal topography is different, that is why erosion is very high. So you have to explain it. So when you explain it, then economics come into picture. So you will be using your remote sensing and economics to do your research.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Anybody else doing a study on ecology among the participants? So even if you don't have a question right now, if in future also you have an issue and you want to, contact me, you are always welcome.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, so you can stop now.
Okay, ma'am. So with this, we come to the end of this fourth technical session. Thank you so much, Saudamini ma'am, for coming and spending your valuable time with us. It was really enlightening, and it showed us how interdisciplinarity comes into play, especially when it comes to climate change studies in economics, and how we can integrate it. Though it's all though it seems very difficult for us as beginners, but it really inspired us to go the extra mile and study the different techniques and apply it in our research as well. So we are really thankful, ma'am. Thank you so much for this time you have spent with us. I would also like to thank Dr. Anita V, the professor and head of our department, and the organizing secretary of this workshop for conducting such an insightful session. Thank you, ma'am. I would also like to thank all the participants, research scholars and students of our department for coming forward and participating. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mira, and thanks all of you. I hope you enjoyed and you are benefited. And in future, if you do an interdisciplinary ecological research, you will be keeping different disciplines in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It really immensely helped us, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I had some trouble in the beginning. I was getting worried that whether I'll be able to deliver the lecture or not, but thankfully it went on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.